Why do we have primaries? Why do we have these sort of qualifying rounds to become the presidential nominee? Well, the answer begins by observing we didn't always have it this way. In any political system, you have to figure out how you are going to recruit candidates for office. The people who wrote the Constitution in 1787 thought that, well, they would probably know most of the people who were going to run. The political class in America in the late 1780s was pretty small. These people had worked with each other in the Continental Congress, in the Congress of the Confederation. They'd worked with each other, some cases in the Army during the Revolutionary War. They had worked with each other in the states. But it was a relatively small group. The population of the United States in 1787 was not as large as the population of Greater New York City today. So it was easy to imagine that these people would know each other. And so figuring out exactly how they would be nominated was not a big deal. Just names would go forward. Furthermore, they were thinking in terms of the Electoral College, and the electors would be the ones doing the deciding, and the electors would be these people who knew candidates. So it was thought that the electors from, let's say, Virginia would know anybody from Virginia who was running, or who could be talked into running for office. And I should add that the verb used in those days wasn't run for office, it was stand for office. Running for office seemed as though, boy, you were too eager to get the job. The job was supposed to come looking for you rather than the other way around. George Washington did not run for office. He he sat for office, and the office came after him. But anyway, one of the reasons for having the electors at all was the electors would be this body of people smaller than the population as a whole who could be expected to know the individuals. It was almost like a job selection committee. So this was the committee, and they would interview the candidates, not formally like an interview, but they would get to know them. So it wasn't considered to be a big problem at first. Now, as things turned out, as political parties developed, the parties began to promote their own candidates. So the Federalist Party, they decided, okay, we're going to choose our leading candidate, and the Republican Party would choose their leading candidate. They didn't have to. They could have had 4 Federalists running. They could have had 6 Republicans running. But because the parties knew that they'd have a better chance if all the Republicans focused on this one person and all the Federalists focused on this other person, then the parties acted as these sifting devices. Now, again, I've said this before, but the people who wrote the Constitution were not thinking in terms of political parties. They thought political parties were a terrible idea, and they hoped the new United States would be spared political parties, but it was not spared. And so the political parties became these recruiting agencies for candidates. But that leaves the question, so how do the parties do it? Well, what the parties did at first was they allowed their caucuses in Congress, that is, the members of the Republican Party in Congress, they would all get together, and as a group they would say, we think that James Madison ought to be our candidate for president. And they would they'd talk about it, they'd argue about it, they'd vote about it, and they'd agree. And that way the Republicans could present a united front, and the Federalists would do the same thing. And this was the method of choosing nominees through the 1820s, but it broke down in the 1820s because the party system broke down. The Federalists got discredited by acting rather disloyal during the War of 1812, and they quickly faded from the scene, leaving the Republicans to be the sole party. Now, you might think that would be really easy, so the Republicans simply nominate somebody and that person becomes president, which is what happened in 1820 when James Monroe was renominated by the Republican Party and he ran essentially unopposed. But a one-party system is unstable in a democracy because people have different ideas and they have different ambitions and they want to compete for office. And so the one-party system broke down, and so the Republicans broke into 2 different wings, and those broke down until they reorganized in the early 1830s. And they reorganized with a new name for the old Republican Party, and it was renamed as the Democratic Party. the Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson had always been the more democratic of the two major parties, the other one being the Federalists. And now that the Republican Party had broken into pieces, no one could claim a proprietary, they didn't have a proprietary claim to the name Republican, so they had to come up with something, so they chose Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party was the party of Andrew Jackson. And the opposition party, these were mostly remnants of the old Republican Party who didn't like Jackson, and also some holdovers from the earlier Federalist Party, and they called themselves Whigs. And one of the things that the two parties did was, separately, they came to the idea of nominating presidential candidates, of choosing a presidential nominee in a party convention, because the country was now getting too big for people in Congress to know all of the candidates. But there also was a revolt on the part of many of the people who supported Andrew Jackson against the idea that members of Congress were the ones who should choose who the presidential nominee ought to be. There was something kind of contradictory about this in the first place, because the Constitution specifies that Congress shall be separate from the executive branch. And if Congress was the body, or at least part of Congress was the body nominating the individuals for the presidency, then that separation was attenuated. So, the political convention became the norm starting in the 1830s. And through the rest of the 1800s down to the beginning of the 20th century, national nominating conventions. They gathered every fourth summer, so the summers of presidential years, and they would bring delegates from all around the country. And the delegates from all around the country would gather, and they would choose each party's nominee. And the delegates served a comparable function to what the electors served in the general election, because the delegates knew the individuals, the people who might be promising candidates. And delegates from Ohio would know who the best of Ohio's politicians were and who would make a good candidate from Ohio, and the same from the other states. So there is this sifting process, and all this business about choosing a nominee for each party is, how do you sift from all the people who might want to be president to get the ones who have the best chance of actually winning the general election? And keep this in mind. The whole point of the nominating process, from the standpoint of the political parties, is how do we maximize our chances of getting our guy elected president? Now, this is not the same thing as saying, how do we maximize the chances of getting the best qualified person to be president of the United States? The reason that the framers of the Constitution didn't like the idea of parties was that they feared that parties would put the interests of parties ahead of the interests of the country. And sometimes that did happen. More than sometimes. It was fairly common for it to happen. But keep this in mind. So the parties now have decided, separately, but they go in the same direction, that we're going to have nominating conventions. And so the nominating conventions took place in the summer of presidential years. And the delegates would come together and they would vote. And who would they vote for? Well, sometimes they'd vote for the people they knew. They would vote for people that they had heard about. They would vote for the people that they thought might have the greatest chance of winning. Who did they consult on this? How did they know that this person would be a good candidate? Well, okay, if you were a delegate, presumably you knew something about what voters in your state or your district were thinking. And so we'd give you an idea. And for about 80 years, this was the way the presidential nominees were chosen. But by the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of people were thinking, this just isn't working very well. And here's why it's not working. That democracy, this idea that people are supposed to be able to choose their president, in this case, it's not working because the people are not being given as much of a say, or a say at all, in who the nominees are. And so people who thought, for example, that big business had too much power in American politics, and there were a lot of people who thought this by the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. Big business has too much power. They associated themselves with the populist movement and then with the progressive movement. And so the problem was not with the election system per se, but with the nomination system. So if both parties are dominated by big money and big business, each party will nominate a candidate who's favorable to big money and big business. And by the time voters get a chance to weigh in, it's going to be a choice between, well, two pretty much same candidate. And so the people have been shut out of this system. So this was the complaint against the system of the national conventions, the national nominating conventions. And so progressives, this is the early part of the 20th century, they thought, so what is the solution to the problems of democracy? And the answer was more democracy. This is typically what the progressive says. The answer to the problems of democracy is more democracy. So how do you inject democracy into the nominating systems? Aha! That's where primaries come in, because primaries are basically sort of quarterfinal, semifinal elections. They are preliminary elections ahead of the main election. The first presidential primaries, and primaries are used not just for president, they're used for other offices as well, for the same reasons. But we're speaking of the presidency, so they're used for the first time in any substantial way in the election of 1912. And what had happened is that the progressives in various states persuaded the states to hold presidential, and the label was presidential preference primaries, because the primaries had no binding authority. Whoever won the primary of the state of Oregon, for example, and Oregon was one of the leaders in this primary movement, the progressive movement. Whoever won, let's say, the Republican primary in Oregon, well, it had no binding authority on anybody. It didn't have any binding authority on the party, on the national convention. It certainly didn't have any binding authority on the presidential election itself. But it did register a preference. Now, at first, the primaries were strictly preferential primaries. In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt running for the Republican nomination. He had been president from 1901 to 1908. 1909. He didn't run for a second full term and a sort of third partial term in 1908. But he did decide to come back into politics to run in 1912. And he challenged the Republican incumbent, William Howard Taft. And Republicans had primaries that year. And Roosevelt won most of the primary votes. So he was clearly more popular among Republican voters, but he did not win the Republican nomination because the primaries were strictly preferential. And Taft, as the incumbent, controlled the nominating process. He controlled more of the delegates. And this was a feature of the primary system from the 1910s really to the early 1970s. Primaries indicated who the more popular candidates were, but they didn't guarantee that the more popular candidate would actually get the nomination. And there were good reasons for this and bad reasons for this. The good reason was, well, members of the party, the ones who took the time to work in the party, who became delegates to the National Convention, they realized that somebody can be popular without necessarily being qualified to be president. And we, as the kind of the permanent members of the party, we have to live with the consequences of this. So that was sort of the good reason for not letting the primaries carry away the nomination process. The bad reason was, well, the parties, they just liked having the power themselves to heck with what ordinary people thought. But things changed by the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And it changed because the idea of democracy caught on even more, to the point where in the late 1960s and early 1970s, people starting in the Democratic Party said, no, we want our primaries to matter. And we want to make sure that the delegates to the convention vote the way the primaries went. And so starting in the early 1970s, the national conventions became almost sort of rubber stamps of the primary results, with the consequence that from the 1970s until now, primaries are really the way you get the nomination. And the person who wins the primaries almost always wins the nomination. It would be considered something of a violation of democracy if a person showed a big lead in the primaries, trounced all the other challengers in the primaries, but didn't get the nomination. Although there are those in both parties who sometimes are nostalgic for the old days when, okay, you know, the people who have a permanent interest in the party, they ought to have a stronger say in who actually gets the nomination. On the Democratic side, the Democrats allow something called super delegates, and these are delegates who are not simply tied to who won the primary in this state or that. They can vote essentially their own judgment as to who would make the better nominee. So at the moment we are with the primary system. The primary system, as I say, began in the early 1900s. It evolved in the course of the 1900s. It changed in the 1970s to what we have today, which is basically the primaries dictate who is going to get the nomination. Will this be the way we go forever and ever? Quite possibly not. Because, well, when Donald Trump got the nomination in 2016, there are a lot of Republicans who were dismayed, thinking, oh my gosh, this guy doesn't stand for anything Republicans stand for. He was popular enough to get votes, a lot of people who were just sick and tired of the government as it was, and they registered a protest vote for Donald Trump. But he got enough votes in the primaries that he won the nomination. And there were a whole lot of people in both parties who thought, well, okay, he's going to go down to defeat in the general election. And so Republicans at that time were thinking, boy, we got to change our system. We nominate this candidate who's popular, but he's going to lose and he's going to take us all down. Well, they stopped thinking about that way when Donald Trump won in 2016. But in the back of minds of people, they're, okay, maybe primaries sometimes deliver us a good candidate, maybe not. And determining what makes a good candidate, well, is it that you can simply get elected? Or is it also, should it also be that you can promote the interests of the party, including positions on policy issues that the party has stood by for a long time? So, one last thing. And because primaries aren't written into the Constitution, they're not written into federal law anywhere, these are just the customs of the parties. And customs can change with time as the perceived needs of the parties change, as maybe they will.